September 30th, 2026, a day that will go down in Tennessee history. On this day, Christa Pike will enter the execution chamber at the Deborah K. Johnson Correctional Center. She'll be 50 years old, but her story began 3 decades earlier when she was only 18. Pike holds a record no one wants. She became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States in the post-Furman era, the period after 1976 when the Supreme Court allowed states to resume executions. For 30 years, she has lived on death row, waiting for this moment to come. If Tennessee carries out the sentence, Pike will become the first woman executed in this state in over 200 years. The last time Tennessee executed a woman was in 1820, over 2 centuries ago. In the final days on death row, time moves slowly like melting wax. Each footstep of a guard echoing in the corridor becomes a reminder of irreversible fate. The eyes of those around, part pity, part shudder, like a mirror reflecting the person she has become. In American history, only 18 women have been executed since 1976. Pike is about to join that rare and haunting list. But what makes this case even more frightening is that Pike didn't act alone that night. 2 other teenagers helped her, yet Pike is the only one who received the death penalty. Darrell Shipp, her boyfriend, 17 years old, received life with possibility of parole. Shadala Peterson, the lookout, received only 6 years probation and didn't spend a single day in prison. 3 people committed the crime, 3 completely different sentences. So what is justice here? What crime could be so horrific as to lead to this historic sentence? How did an 18-year-old troubled girl become the face of one of Tennessee's most notorious crimes? What happened in those dark woods on that cold January night? And why, after 30 years, does this case still divide the nation? To answer those questions, we must go back to the night of January 12th, 1995. The night 2 young lives were destroyed forever. 1 person lost their life. 1 person lost their future, and between them, the line between victim and perpetrator began to blur in ways no one could have imagined. January 12th, 1995. A cold winter evening at the Job Corps Training Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. Christa Pike had a plan. In her mind, Colleen Slemmer, a 19-year-old girl, was trying to steal Darrell Shipp, Pike's boyfriend. Slemmer's friends later completely denied this, but in Pike's mind, jealousy had become an obsession, and Slemmer had to pay. Pike didn't act alone. She brought 2 accomplices. The first was Darrell Shipp, her 17-year-old boyfriend. The second was Shadala Peterson, 18, who agreed to come along as lookout. The plan was simple but cruel. Pike would approach Slemmer with a friendly face, saying she wanted to make peace. She would invite Slemmer to smoke marijuana as a gesture of reconciliation, and once they got Slemmer to an isolated spot in the woods, they would attack. That evening, Pike executed the plan. She approached Slemmer at the dormitory, her expression convincing and friendly. Slemmer trusted her. The girl wanted to end the tension between them. All 4 signed out of the dormitory together. The sign-out log recorded their names and the time they left. It was a cold evening. They walked toward an abandoned steam plant near the University of Tennessee campus. Slemmer had no idea what awaited her in those woods. She thought she would smoke marijuana and make peace with Pike. Instead, she was walking toward death. The abandoned steam plant was the perfect location for what Pike had planned. It was remote, out of sight, and far enough from the dormitory that no one would hear screams. When the 4 teenagers arrived, darkness had fallen over Knoxville. At first, everything seemed normal. Pike still played friendly with Slemmer, but when they reached the isolated spot, the mask fell. Pike and Shipp turned on Slemmer without warning. Peterson stepped back to act as lookout. The attack began with insults. Pike screamed in Slemmer's face, accusing her of trying to steal Shipp. Slemmer denied it. The girl cried, begged Pike to listen, but Pike no longer wanted to talk. Then the violence began. Pike and Shipp punched and kicked Slemmer repeatedly. The girl tried to defend herself, but was outnumbered. Slemmer's screams echoed through the dark woods. She begged for mercy. Pike refused to stop. Pike pulled out a box cutter. She slashed Slemmer's face and body. Blood poured from the wounds. Slemmer was in extreme pain, but the torture continued. According to trial testimony, Pike also used a meat cleaver in the attack. She hacked into Slemmer's flesh while the girl screamed, but Pike wanted to do something even more twisted. She carved a 5-pointed star, a pentagram symbol, onto Slemmer's chest. This symbol was deliberate, reflecting Pike's interest in Satanism. Some reports say she also carved a pentagram on Slemmer's forehead. The cuts were deep and painful. Slemmer was still alive. The girl was bleeding heavily, breathing with difficulty and begging to live. But Pike had no mercy. She picked up rocks and beat Slemmer with them. Each blow aimed to cause maximum pain. Cold moonlight filtered through the tree canopy, illuminating the nightmare scene. Then, Pike found a large chunk of concrete. She lifted it high above her head and smashed it down onto Slemmer's skull. The impact was horrific. Slemmer's skull shattered. The girl died instantly. Even after Slemmer was dead, Pike wasn't finished. She took the knife and cut a piece of Slemmer's skull. She held it up like a trophy. Then, she stuffed it into her jacket pocket. It was her souvenir from the murder. What happened next was even more terrifying. Pike began dancing around Slemmer's body. She sang. She celebrated what she had done. Shipp and Peterson stood watching in shock. The entire attack lasted over 30 minutes. Eerie silence descended over the woods after the final blow. Only the sound of wind through trees and the heavy breathing of 3 killers remained. Finally, the 3 teenagers left the scene. They walked back to the Job Corps Center together. Only 3 people returned. Pike acted as if nothing had happened. She didn't seem sad or afraid. She seemed proud. The next morning, Pike went to breakfast as usual. She sat with other students and ate her meal. The piece of Slemmer's skull was still in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and showed it to everyone at the table. She bragged about what she had done. She described the murder in vivid detail. Some students thought she was joking. Others were horrified. But Pike didn't care. She was casual, almost matter-of-fact about the whole thing. To her, killing Colleen Slemmer wasn't something to feel guilty about. It was something to brag about. But to understand how Christa Pike became a killer, we need to go back to the beginning. She was born March 10th, 1976 in Beckley, West Virginia. But her life was difficult from the start. Pike was born premature to parents Carissa Hansen and Glenn Pike. Her family life was chaotic. Her parents had a turbulent relationship. They married, then divorced after 2 years when Hansen was discovered having an affair. Hansen attempted suicide, and they remarried. The second marriage lasted another 2 years before breaking apart again. Both parents frequently neglected their children. The only person who gave Pike real love was her paternal grandmother. This woman regularly cared for Christa when her parents didn't. Pike later said her grandmother was the only one who truly loved her. Then, in 1988, when Pike was only 12, her grandmother died. Pike was devastated. She attempted suicide but received very little support from family. This was only the beginning of her mental health struggles. Pike's mother testified that Christa had tried to overdose on acetaminophen since 3rd grade. After that incident, Pike received psychiatric treatment, but nothing seemed to help. Pike's living situation was never stable. As a teenager, she moved between households and experienced violence from both sides. She was both victim and perpetrator. One of her mother's boyfriends punched her in the face after Pike chased him with a butter knife. When Pike lived with her father's new family, one of her younger half-sisters accused Pike of sexually abusing her. Pike's father kicked her out of the house immediately. By age 12, Pike was dependent on alcohol and marijuana. She attempted suicide multiple more times as a teenager. In 10th grade, Pike was placed in a juvenile facility for a year. There, she learned about Job Corps, a government program helping low-income youth through vocational training. In late 1994, Pike enrolled at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville. She was looking for a fresh start, a chance to change her life. Instead, she met Tatterall Shipp. They started dating. Together, they developed an interest in the occult and devil worship. Pike's life became more unstable, and just weeks later, Colleen Slemmer would be dead. The morning after the murder, a groundskeeper doing routine work near the abandoned steam plant discovered something in the woods that made him stop. At first, he thought it was a dead animal. The body was so disfigured it didn't look human. But as he came closer, the horrific truth became clear. It was a person. It was Colleen Slemmer. The groundskeeper immediately called police. When investigators arrived at the scene, they were shocked by what they saw. Slemmer's body showed signs of extreme torture. The 5-pointed star carved on her chest, the crushed skull, the slashes and cuts all over her body. This wasn't just murder. This was something far more brutal. In Knoxville's criminal history, few cases bore such savage characteristics. Even seasoned investigators shuddered at the scene. Police knew they had to act fast. They went straight to the Job Corps Center and checked the dormitory sign-out log. Records showed 4 people had left together the previous evening: Christa Pike, Darrell Shipp, Shadala Peterson, and Colleen Slemmer. Only 3 returned. Within 36 hours, Pike, Shipp, and Peterson were arrested. During the search, detectives found the piece of Slemmer's skull in Pike's jacket pocket. That was the evidence they needed. Pike didn't try to hide what she had done. She confessed to police almost immediately. She described the attack in detail. She admitted to torture and murder, but insisted they only meant to scare Slemmer. She said things just got out of control. Witnesses from Job Corps came forward one by one. They told police Pike had shown off the skull fragment. She had bragged about the murder. She had described exactly how she killed Slemmer. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The community reaction was swift and fierce. Knoxville residents were horrified. They couldn't believe an 18-year-old girl could commit such a brutal crime. The case made national news. People wanted to know how something like this could happen. What confused people even more was Pike's lack of remorse. In her initial statements, she showed no guilt. She didn't apologize. She didn't seem to understand the severity of what she had done. To many, Christa Pike seemed like a demon. All 3 teenagers were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. But their paths through the justice system would be very different. Shadala Peterson made a deal with prosecutors. She agreed to testify against Pike and Shipp in exchange for a lighter sentence. Peterson pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. In return, she received 6 years probation. She wouldn't spend a single day in prison. Darrell Shipp was only 17 at the time of the murder, but he was tried as an adult. Prosecutors sought life without parole. In January 1997, Shipp was convicted on both charges. However, the jury couldn't agree on whether he should spend the rest of his life in prison without possibility of parole. Because of this, the judge sentenced him to life with possibility of parole. The judge also added a consecutive 25-year sentence for conspiracy, describing Shipp as a dangerous individual. This meant Shipp wouldn't be eligible for parole until he was nearly 50. He'll be eligible for parole in January 2026. Christa Pike's trial began in early 1996. Prosecutors had a strong case. They presented Pike's detailed confession. They introduced the piece of Slemmer's skull found in her jacket. They brought witnesses who testified Pike had bragged about the murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors emphasized Pike's leadership role in the crime. They argued she had planned the attack. She had lured Slemmer into the woods. She had carved the pentagram. She had delivered the final fatal blow. And she had taken the skull fragment as a trophy. Pike's defense team tried to explain her actions through her troubled past. They presented evidence of her mental illness, childhood trauma, and abuse. 2 defense experts testified about Pike's mental state. Dr. Eric Engum believed Pike simply lost control. Dr. William Burnett testified about group dynamics and collective aggression. He said adolescents are more vulnerable to this type of behavior in group settings. But the jury wasn't convinced. On March 22, 1996, after only a few hours of deliberation, Pike was convicted on both charges. 8 days later, on March 30, 1996, she was sentenced to death by electric chair for murder and 25 years in prison for conspiracy. The moment of sentencing brought absolute silence to the courtroom. Pike stood there, face blank, eyes not glistening. She was 20 years old, but her life was over. The disparity in sentences sparked immediate controversy. Pike received death. Shipp received life with parole. Peterson received probation. 3 people. Same crime, 3 completely different fates. Questions hung in the air. Who was truly the mastermind? Why did only Pike have to die? And was justice truly served? After sentencing, Christa Pike was transferred to death row. She became Tennessee's only woman on death row. While male death row inmates lived together at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, Pike was held separately at the Deborah K. Johnson Correctional Center. For decades, Pike lived in conditions her attorney Angela Berman described as the size of a parking space. She spent most of her time in near-complete solitary confinement, isolated from other incarcerated women. She had very little human interaction and limited time out of her cell. In that dark chamber, time became an invisible enemy. The clock ticking, dreams of the past, memories of that fateful night repeating like a stuck videotape. The cold 18-year-old who once danced around a corpse was now a woman in her 40s, then 50s, sitting alone in darkness, facing her own demons. Pike eventually filed a lawsuit about these prison conditions, arguing they were inhumane. In September 2024, Pike reached an agreement with the state. The agreement gave her privileges equivalent to what male death row inmates received. She was given a job, allowed to eat with other incarcerated women, and given more time out of her cell. After more than a decade, her isolation finally ended. But Pike's time on death row wasn't without incident. On August 24, 2001, Pike attacked inmate Patricia Jones. With alleged assistance from inmate Natasha Cornett, Pike tried to strangle Jones with a shoelace. She nearly succeeded in choking her to death. In 2003, Pike was convicted of attempted first-degree murder and received an additional 25-year sentence for the attack. Then, in March 2012, authorities discovered an escape plot. Pike had been exchanging letters with Donald Kohut, a personal trainer from New Jersey. Kohut had made the nearly 1,700-mile round trip from Flemington, New Jersey to Nashville to visit Pike once or twice a month. He enlisted the help of corrections officer Justin Heflin, who agreed to participate in exchange for cash and gifts. The plan involved tracing and copying prison keys, but prison staff received information about the plot before it could be executed. Kohut was arrested and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Heflin cooperated with authorities and was fired from his job, but didn't serve time. Pike wasn't charged. Years after her arrest, Pike was finally diagnosed with bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. In an August 2023 letter, Pike wrote about her remorse. She said, "Think back to the worst mistake you made as a reckless teenager. Mine happens to be colossal, unforgettable, and devastated countless lives." On September 30th, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court issued a death warrant for Christa Pike. Her execution was scheduled exactly 1 year later, September 30th, 2026. If carried out, Pike will become the first woman executed in Tennessee since 1820, over 200 years. Pike's attorneys immediately began legal efforts to stop the execution. They filed appeals citing her youth at the time of the crime, severe mental illness, and what they called evolving standards of decency. They argued that executing someone for a crime committed at 18 violates Eighth Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The legal debate centered on the Supreme Court case Roper versus Simmons. In 2005, the court ruled that executing anyone under 18 is unconstitutional. The decision acknowledged that young people have less developed brains, poor impulse control, and greater capacity for rehabilitation. Pike's lawyers argued the same reasoning should apply to 18-year-olds. In 2019, Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Jane Stranch wrote a concurring opinion in Pike's case. She stated Pike's death sentence potentially violates the Eighth Amendment because of her age. Judge Stranch noted that if Pike had been 17 instead of 18, like her accomplice Darrell Shipp, she wouldn't have been eligible for the death penalty. Judge Stranch concluded, "I believe the evolving standards of decency in our society may not permit execution of individuals under 21 at the time of the offense." Public campaigns emerged on both sides. Tennesseans for alternatives to the death penalty collected over 2,500 signatures on a petition asking Governor Bill Lee to stop the execution. But not everyone wanted to spare Pike. Mae Martinez, Colleen Slemmer's mother, supports the execution. She told the Tennessean, that the piece of her daughter's skull, Pike took remains in state custody. Martinez said she cannot have peace while it's still there. Pike's case highlights the rarity of women on death row. Of nearly 9,000 people sentenced to death since 1976, only 179 or 2% were women. Only 18 women have been executed in the United States during that time. Public opinion on capital punishment has also changed significantly, with opposition nearly tripling in the past 3 decades. The case of Christa Pike and Colleen Slemmer has left a lasting mark on Tennessee and the American justice system. 2 young lives destroyed on that cold January night in 1995. Colleen Slemmer lost her life to a brutal murder. Christa Pike lost her future to a death sentence. For May Martinez, Slemmer's mother, the pain never ends. She has waited decades for justice and closure. For Pike's lawyers, the case represents a failure to recognize the impact of youth, trauma, and mental illness on criminal behavior. If Pike is executed on September 30th, 2026, she will join only 18 other women executed since 1976. She will be the first woman executed in Tennessee in over 2 centuries. This case forces us to ask difficult questions. Can someone who commits a horrific crime at 18 truly be beyond redemption? Does the death penalty serve justice, or does it simply add another tragedy to an already tragic story? September 30th, 2026 is approaching. Christa Pike will enter the execution chamber. A page of history will close. But the question remains, what is justice when both victim and perpetrator lose everything?